Hi guys, Tyler Forrester for RunItOnce.com. Okay, so this is another example of a good situation where I think a 3-bet squeeze is going to make money because this fellow has demonstrated he likes to fold to 3-bets. This fellow we don't have a large sample on, but he's also folding to 3-bets fairly significantly. One of the things that Darchus was doing in-game, which I liked, was labeling these player types as either red, which I assume is a pro that he thinks is reasonably decent, or green as a fish. What I'd also like to see from Darchus in these situations is essentially to label what type of fish he is, because this particular guy looks like he's probably playing about 15% of hands. And my strategy choices against someone who plays 15% of hands as opposed to someone who plays 60% of hands are going to be markedly different. And so when I'm color coding my recreational players, I make sure to have multiple colors based on how they play. Whether they're loose, whether they're tight, or whether they're tight pre-flop, whether they're loose pre-flop, post-flop. Because all of those things are going to inform me on how often I can bluff them, what sort of hands to value bet, etc. And so I'd really like to see a squeeze here. We might see it. This sneaks into enough bunker ranges that we'll probably see a squeeze in this situation. And you see the insta-fold by the fellow who's folding too much to 3-bet. And then this fellow's likely to flat, I think, given how tight he's been thus far. This isn't necessarily a big deal. And certainly him folding there definitely adds more credence to this idea that that fold to 3-bet number at 100%, though it's not 100, is probably fairly high. Because if he was folding, say, 33% of the time to 3-bet, even two samples of him folding would only happen about 10% of the time. So here with Jack 4 of clubs, I think fold is fine. Alright, so this is a good situation to kind of think about which sort of fish you're playing against. Someone who's managed to VIP 43% of the time after 7 samples, and has a 40 big blind stack, is likely very, very wide in this situation. It would be very unlikely for him to actually be a 7-7, basically because he would have had to pull the top 7% of the hands 3 out of 7 times. And so this would be a situation where normally I think that it's a close situation as pro short stackers. I think usually you go with it, but it would be close. Against this sort of player, I'm pretty happily getting all in pre. And so that's exactly what I'd like to see Darchus do here. And if you don't get all in pre, I think that flat is definitely better than fold, and then this is just clearly all in. There's really no play with this sort of stack size on this board texture after half pot, and you have 50% equity against range. Calling range, so maybe a little bit more, so pretty easy all in. You expect to make somewhere between 9 and 12 big blinds. And he has jacks, which we're actually ahead of, so we make our 10.3 big blinds here. And hopefully we win the flip, and we did. The fact he has jacks doesn't change my opinion of that hand, because essentially what happens there is that he's going to wake up with some strong hands. I'm willing to trust the fact that my HUD says that he's been very aggressive early in the match, and I'm going to assume that that aggression translates across positions. I don't think that players of these limits tend to tone down or tone up aggression. They play pretty much the same strategy against everyone and against every position, so that's really what I'm looking for the recreational players. So this is an excellent situation where, like, the labeling here is probably a little bit off, because from my perspective, Moroz might even be a winning player in these games at 26-17, and so that's going to be a pretty decent change from somebody like Zimpy, who looks like he probably is just going to try to give away his money. This can be 3-betted, it can be flatted. I think given the cold call, you're usually squeezing. Good squeeze. I don't think anyone's doing anything different here at this point. And Johnny Shu, I believe, is a reg in these games, if I remember correctly from watching the last video. And so I do expect a ton of pocket pairs from him. This is going to lead us down this path on this board texture where you kind of expect two barrels to be very, very effective. Because he's going to basically float this flop with any fours through jacks and then fold flop. And the fact he folded flop there, I think, is an interesting note, because there's not a lot of hands in that range that necessarily want to fold that flop. It might be he's as loose as something like ace-jack off in that situation. It's a little hard to name fold hands there. Maybe king-10 without a backdoor flush draw. But even those are going to be fairly close against 1/3. So I would write down a note, either mentally or in-game, that he likely calls squeezes fairly light. That's the most likely scenario there. Okay, so I'm going to start the video here again. I'm just going to try to skip through and find interesting spots. See, when you see this fold to 3-bet at 84 and you've got a hand that's a cuspy 3-bet, you have to hit it. Basically, this region has to be 3-bet against somebody who's folding 80% of the time plus to 3-bets. It's going to net a ton of money, maybe upwards of 2 big blinds against this sort of player, and so I'm going to pure 3-bet this region, even though Pios mix this at reasonably low frequencies in this spot. I mean, that's why you have this number on your HUD, is to take advantage of that sort of player. Okay, so we have this hand with ace-8. We've got a 10-10-3, which he's marked as a fish. I mean, again, I would like a label for this guy. I like the flop check against this sort of player because he's likely fairly tight in these situations, which means that this board texture basically slaughters his range, so the check is standard. Here on the turn, I mean, showing down an 8, I think, is very, very standard in these situations, but I mean, if you figure he's going to fold any jack, any 10, any 9, and he doesn't have any queens, or very few, like, it's actually fairly close between a bet and a check. And he has 4s, so I would mark that he defends pocket pairs in the small blind. At 10-10, it wouldn't necessarily be an expected strategy choice from that player type. And so it's something to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out what sort of board textures to bet, what sort of hands he can have. I mean, ideally this game. And so here's another spot where you've got someone who looks hyper-aggressive pre-flop, or at least fairly aggressive pre-flop with a 12% 3-bet. I think that's easily clears threshold at this sort of game. One of the things I would be looking for, especially in these player pools, is how often they fold a 4-bet. Because it turns out if this 12% is an accurate stat of this situation, he only has jacks plus here about a quarter of the time. And the fact that we have the ace of clubs in our hand probably reduces that even farther to something like 20% of the time. And so it's not inconceivable against this player type that he could fold to 4-bet something like 70 to 80% of the time. And we've got a hand that's going to be cuspy at equilibrium as a 4-bet. It would seem like a great situation basically to take advantage of that sort of flaw and just go ahead and 4-bet him pre-flop. And realistically, if you don't have the fold to 4-bet number, you can always look at the fold to 3-bet number. Those things usually track pretty closely to each other. So the fact he likes to overfold to 3-bet means he likely overfolds to 4-bet too. You've got the same situation here. Against memory 62, high fold to 3-bets over a reasonable sample, likely high fold to 4. 6s here with the overcall to the small all-in bet. I have no preference here. I do think you should bet flop almost always, though. Essentially what's going on this board texture is that your hand needs protection. You have to have some bets that bet fold these boards. Otherwise, it's going to be fairly easy for your opponent to play against you because he's just going to know that you're not bet folding when you bet. And this region plays pretty well against the all-in range. It probably has 35, 40, 45% equity depending on how tight he is. That's the sort of semi-bluff you want in these scenarios because you have to have showdown value to semi-bluff. So this completely flips because of this all-in guy. And with the all-in guy in the pot now, 6s gets upgraded as a bet and something like 9-8 of clubs gets downgraded. Because we're going to have to show this thing down, so we have to be able to win the pot when Eduardo God folds. And here, this is super marginal. Calling's fine. I mean, you have equity. It can't be bad, but not exactly excited. And then on this sort of board texture, I think checking down makes sense. You're not going to have a lot of... You're not going to win a lot of the pot. Again, though, this would be the sort of regions where you want to turn that into a bluff as opposed to something like King-Queen with a King of Diamonds. Because of the all-in player, you have to have equity against that in the original pot to make bluffing reasonable. Because you're not just going to get the pot when the guy folds. You're going to get some fraction of that pot. So, as far as I know, like, this is a standard call with 3 deuce. This guy, I mean, there's no label on him yet, but given sizings, I'm going to guess, and his preflop stats and even his name, I'm going to guess he's some sort of regular in these games. That's definitely worth noting pretty much immediately. Flat, I'm sure people will tell you is standard there, and then he looks very reg-ish, so I would be marking him down as a reg. Flat seems standard. And then, I mean, clear jam. You just hope he cold decks his flush, which is really a fairly high portion of range, I think, given the way that hand played out. King 6 of diamonds, basically, Pio's going to tell you to check this region occasionally because, essentially, you can't bet this board very often. That being said, I mean, I think one of the key things to look at from this sort of player type is like how often he check raises. And I mean, this particular player does not look terribly aggressive. He looks like he's trying to make his money, and the less check raises you get, the more likely you are to bet this hand. And so, I mean, that's a stat I consistently look at here against players, and this guy is like... He kind of looks like a nit who wants to stack fish, so I'm kind of guessing I'm not going to get a lot of craziness here. Turn bet here against that player type could be very, very standard with almost every single hand in range. And now we're actually kind of in trouble, I think. I would be calling, and then I'm not actually looking to stack here, I don't think, against 1918. I'm just worried that he doesn't have enough. He doesn't have enough worse flushes in region. To actually get all the money in, but it's reasonably close, so I'm going to call this most of the time. And then he's got Queen Jack of Diamonds, which is a pure 3-bet preflop, so I would definitely note that, and I would definitely note that he tried to check raise turn with it, and then he overbet river, because that's going to inform you long-term on how that guy approaches those situations. If he leads on that board texture, it's very likely you'll be able to bluff raise him, because he's not going to have the majority of nut hands in that region. In fact, I think Queen Jack of Diamonds is one of the most preferred bets, because it doesn't block a lot of the Ace X calls, a lot of the King X calls you're going to get, and it doesn't really want to give a free card to those hands. And so I suspect if you look at a sim, you're going to see that hand being bet very, very frequently, because it's got a lot of great properties as a bet and not a lot of great properties as a check raise. Now, because it's Pio, you'll see a whole bunch of interesting ideas there with balance across all lines, but I think that long term, like, the important thing to note there is that player doesn't likes to check raise nut hands on blanks. I mean, that would be a very viable note. It's also a very viable note that he doesn't 3-bet Queen Jack of Diamonds big blind versus button, because that's something that I think every model does at almost 100% frequency. With some very, very few flats, depending on some really interesting post-flop play. Truthfully, I don't think anybody knows why Pio flats those hands there. The 3-bets are because they're great semi-bluffing hands, but the flats are really deep into the game tree and have a lot to do with essentially board coverage. And it's a little hard to imagine why you need Queen Jack of Diamonds for board coverage, because you have Queen Jack off and you have Queen 4 of Diamonds, so you seem to cover both those regions very easily without ever flatting that hand. Which I think is why that's usually pure in most models.